Hi everyone, my name's Nick Aresti. I've been asked to talk to you today about conflict resolution. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. You'll have to do with this recorded lecture with Mr. Kang helping out live. My background is I'm a consultant at Barts Health, so that's one of the biggest trusts in the country, and we run orthopaedics out of three sites: the Royal London with all the big trauma, and Whips Cross, which is the new fragility site, and also all our elective work's done out of Newham. In terms of leadership, I've been recently appointed the clinical lead of the Whips Cross site. I was also one of Bruce Keogh's clinical fellows back in 2015-16, where I worked predominantly at the CQC with Mike Richards. On a side note, if any of you are interested in this, I'd thoroughly encourage it. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch via the email there. So the first thing I suppose we should do is actually think about what is conflict. Put some messages in the text box below, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of a discussion about what conflict actually is. I thought this was a pretty good definition. So a conflict is a disagreement or clash between ideas, principles, or people. So it's not necessarily just an argument between two people with regard to their own ideologies. It can be about services or the manner in which we practice orthopedics or other specialties. So in terms of conflict resolution, it's important to recognize that an individual's behavior is often not directed at us, but a set of circumstances faced by them. Where there are people, there is going to be conflict. We all bring values, needs, idiosyncrasies to the workplace, and sometimes these can clash and we can have conflict with our colleagues. I think this is especially important in healthcare because most of what we do involves some form of social interaction, so there is plenty of opportunity for conflict to arise. Left unchecked, conflict can brew and lead to animosity. Teams can break down, morale in teams drops, tasks often grind to a halt or are far more difficult to complete. And organizations, not just within healthcare, but big corporations, feel the hit too. Talent's wasted, productivity's down, there's higher rates of absenteeism, increased staff turnover, and ultimately, unfortunately in our case, it affects outcomes for patient care. Now, resolving conflict doesn't necessarily have to mean a return to the status quo. It can actually lead to innovation. Conflict doesn't necessarily need to be about aggression or issues between people. It can simply be because two or more people believe a different path has to be taken. So the manner in which conflict can be resolved can really determine whether or not it can be used productively and spark innovation, or it can be used to, or it can lead to hindrance of productivity, as mentioned previously. So delving into it a little bit further, I think it's worth thinking about the types of conflict that we can come across in the workplace and also the causes of them. Generally in the workplace, conflict falls into one of two categories. The first is personality or affective, and the second is substantive. Personality conflict tends to be disagreements between individuals. So they're largely driven or perpetrated by emotions, and that can be anger, stress, or frustration. And this type of conflict accounts for probably about half of all workplace conflicts. The other common one is substantive conflicts. And this is a little bit in relation to what I previously mentioned, where it's not necessarily about emotion or aggression, rather it's due to tangible task-related issues. For example, the decisions that your leaders make might not be something you agree with, or the performance of team members may not be up to scratch according to somebody else. Or it could be the direction of the trust or the NHS in a whole. If unaddressed, both personality or substantive conflict can lead to wider conflicts between teams, departments, or business. And again, ultimately, it leads to poorer patient outcomes or issues with patient safety. So what can cause conflict in the workplace? Well, three main categories spring to mind. The first one is unclear responsibilities. So some team members may feel that they do more work than others. This can be within a department such as orthopedics or wider. So the orthopedic registrar may often be found tucked up in bed at night time, whereas the medical registrar is running around like a headless chicken. This can lead to conflict. Blame, frustration can all build up due to duplicated work or unfinished tasks or breeding conflict. Another issue may well be competition for resources. So time, money, materials, or I think what I'm increasingly noticing in our trust is competition for operative space leads to conflict. Ultimately, we all think our specialty is the most important, and trying to find a balance is tough. The other factor which is worth considering is different interests. So people may focus on personal over organizational goals. So I think it's more important to fix a hip fracture than it is for a general surgeon to perform a laparotomy. Or they may be held up or frustrated by others who they rely on to do their jobs more effectively. So how do we deal with conflict? There are two poles that are worth considering. One is to engage or disengage, or the other is to attract and repel. And within that, we bring this fight or flight concept. So fighters in the face of conflict react in challenging ways. At work, this might revolve around shouting or losing temper. People who use flight as a reaction generally turn away from conflicts or what's going on around them. And this is a very common reaction because people often like ignoring problems and hoping that they just go away or resolve themselves. Freezing is often an issue. People just don't know how to react to conflict, and they can become very passive. You might begin to deal with an issue, but things drift or become drawn out through indecision and never get resolved. Perhaps the best way to deal with them is to face them. And how do you face them? Well, there are these 5 simple steps. I'm sure there's lots of mnemonics out there, and you might well get asked about this in interviews, whether it's for registrar or consultant post, but it's the themes that I think are important to take home. So the first thing is to identify the conflict. Some conflicts are just glaringly obvious with people shouting at each other across a trauma room, but others might be more subtle, and it's important to be able to identify them and prove that you understand them. The second step is to raise the issue early. Make sure that everyone who is concerned is addressed. Pulling wool over your eyes or freezing or flying away always lets things fester and they rarely resolve. It's important to be direct, engaging and assertive, and encourage others to do the same. Not everybody is born to be able to deal with conflict, and if you feel uncomfortable to do so, it's important to pass the baton on or feed it up the chain of command. Don't forget that, and I keep going on about this, but it's a really important take-home message because it's what people want to hear in an interview, that patient safety and patient care is the most important thing. So if you identify conflict and don't feel that you're able to resolve it on your own, it's important that you pass it on and not just ignore it. So number 3 is find out all the relevant facts. You have to establish both sides of the argument. What are the key levers? What is making each side take a conflicting stance? Are they legitimate reasons or are there ulterior motives? And is it a personal issue or is it a substantive issue? Number 4, look for shared or common values. In a healthcare setting, this is normally patient safety, patient care, but you have to empower people to help identify their own common values, help people realize why they are getting upset or agitated about a scenario, and always work towards a patient's or the service's best interest rather than the best interest of the individual. Finally, it's about identifying a solution that satisfies both parties or both groups of people. And a nice way of looking at this is through this chart that I came across on Google. So it uses two axes to describe two parties. So one being yourself for the sake of this, and the other being an opposing party. So it describes 5 ways of being able to deal with a conflict. The first is demand. And demanding usually involves focusing only on your needs and ignoring the needs of other parties. So it's like an I win and you lose orientation. When being demanding, people stand up for their rights and strongly defend their position, and they give little consideration to others or the positions of other parties. You're likely to be or choose a demanding mode when the outcome is really important to you, and maintaining ongoing positive relationships with the other parties is unimportant. The next step or the next scenario is avoid. So avoiding involves ignoring or withdrawing from a conflict or a situation and not dealing with it at all. It's really a lose-lose because no parties get anything out of it, mainly because the issue hasn't really been dealt with in a satisfactory way. Problem with avoiding behavior is that it's likely to resurface at a later date and potentially in a more serious form. It really only does deal with issues in the short term because it allows you to withdraw from a situation and take time to consider your options and strategy before coming back into the fray. The next step is conceding. So it's like the opposite of the demanding approach. So conceding involves giving in to the other party's demands or requests and leaving little or nothing in return. So it's an I lose, you win, rather than I win, you lose orientation. In extreme cases, it involves giving in totally to the other party and letting them have their way entirely. The main problem with conceding behavior is that it sets a precedent. So if you concede too often, eventually the other parties will expect you to concede, and being able to fight your corner becomes increasingly different. Now, the pinnacle of what we should all aim for is cooperative outcomes. So cooperating involves high degree of appreciation between all parties and their needs. It's an I win and you win orientation. It requires taking time to explore and appreciate the concerns, the expectations of everybody involved. And it really does lead to better insights to the issues involved. And this is where you get creative, effective, innovative, and good can come out of conflict. Now, I think the behavior that we see most in conflict is probably compromise. So you get some gains and some losses. So there's an element of trading by which you give up some of the things important to you, but take some of the things that are important to other parties. As I said, it's gains and losses. And it usually involves finding a mutually acceptable position for all parties involved. So we've reached the end of our session on conflict resolution. It really has been just a whistle-stop tour. There is a lot of theory behind this topic, and there are loads of published books and experts and people who make a career out of conflict resolution. For me, it's important just to understand the basics. Of course, when you notice conflict, hopefully now you know how to deal with it a bit better. But this is interview fodder, so you have to be able to reel off some of the topics we've touched on in an interview setting. If you have any further questions, please feel free to get in contact. My email address is on the slide, and I'm sure Neil will point you in the direction of some other resources if need be.